Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cole Akers, and I am a curator at the... can you hear me all right back there? Not so much? A little bit more. How does that sound? Okay, very good. Thank you. So my name's Cole, and I'm a curator at the Philip Johnston Glass House up in Connecticut, and curator of the exhibition that we have the pleasure of sitting among today. Before I begin, I'd like to quickly thank the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage for their generous support of this project, as well as the critical role that they played in its inception. I'd also like to thank the Catt Center for Advanced Judaic Studies and the Sachs Center for Arts Innovation at the University of Pennsylvania for kindly partnering with us on today's program. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone at the Beth Sholom Synagogue Preservation Foundation and congregation for their incredible spirit of openness and experimentation with which they approach this first commission for their Frank Lloyd Wright building. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Jill Rosen, Helene Mansheim, Robin Minkoff, and especially Herb Sachs, who founded the Preservation Foundation and created this generous space for the exhibition to take place. Today, I'm privileged to introduce our three panelists whose work engages in various ways with ideas about history and site. To my left, David Hartt, whose exhibition you've been meandering through today. David creates work that explores how historic ideas and ideals persist or transform over time. He's a professor in the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania. Next to David, Stephen Prina is an artist, musician, and composer who has exhibited internationally and splits his time between LA and Cambridge, where he is a professor at the Department of Visual and Environmental Studies at Harvard. When David and I began thinking about the panel, two of Stephen's projects came immediately to mind. The first, as he remembered it, which is an exhibition where Stephen recreated built-in furniture by Rudolf Schindler and presented them as autonomous objects rendered in pink within the space of the show, as well as the way he always wanted it to, a 35mm film shot in a house designed by architect and Frank Lloyd Wright associate Bruce Goff. And next to Stephen, we are very lucky to have with us Sharon Johnston, who is a partner in the LA-based practice Johnston Markley and a professor in practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Some of the firm's recent projects include the exquisite Manil Drawing Institute in Houston, as well as the new graduate art studios at UCLA. And at present, they're also engaged with Philadelphia Contemporary on a new building project here in the city. Together with her partner, Mark Lee, she served as the artistic director of the 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennial. They work very closely with artists and have worked with David on a number of occasions. Today, we are going to touch on a number of topics. I'm sure it'll be a very wide-ranging conversation that has to do with site-responsive practices, both in art and architecture, while keeping in mind, of course, the context that we're in now, this exhibition at Beth Sholom that certainly in many ways renegotiates the public's experience of the building and also writing in new narrative possibilities for the space, namely histories of Jewish and African diasporas within the United States. So to begin, I wonder, maybe David, you could start. I'd wonder if each of our panelists could talk a little bit about the way in which you think about site and engage with site in your practice.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
No, should maybe, well, yeah, pass the microphone around. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yeah. So, just sitting up here and looking out at this space and seeing all of you kind of engaging with it in this way, I just wanted to take a moment to kind of acknowledge that and For me, this is something very, very new. So I think the way that I have thought about sight in the past was one in which I was very much instrumentalizing the histories and conceptual potential of a site. And in fact, what drives my work is very much an interest in the realm of ideas, of concepts, and particularly what I kind of refer to as unstable concepts. And so when I choose a site, it's really about how that site allows me to dimensionalize that unstable quality within a concept. An example is the idea of sovereignty. So I made a film on the island of Tuvalu in the South Pacific, an island which is slowly disappearing, as a way to kind of address perhaps the kind of fraught kind of idea of nationhood and of cultural history and of our relationship to the environment. So sovereignty was being dimensionalized through the kind of tenacious relationship that the Tuvalese had to their island. But here, this is something very, very different. This is actually being invited here to actually work, to make a work. The site was foregrounded. It came first, and I had to figure out a way to perhaps ask it to accommodate a set of concepts. And so for me, the idea of dealing with, the history of diaspora as something that I perhaps found within the histories of the Beth Sholom congregation was very interesting. But I think also trying to think about how sight itself can be dimensionalized in many different ways. So thinking about the kind of capacity of this structure to hold many different ideas of community simultaneously. So our experience today here is an extension of that, perhaps, conceptualization. Yeah.
Because I don't think this is working very well. Just pick this off.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Stephen Prina, and just to make a few comments about my work in relationship to a site. I studied with Michael Asher when I was a graduate student at California Institute of the Arts. And we always talked about Michael as being the prince of context. And so for those of us who studied with him, such as Christopher Williams and myself, we felt that we needed to find a different way to deal with sight. So a lot of times we didn't describe our works as being site-specific. We described our works as being system-specific. So we were interested in all of the different formations that circulate artworks and become display systems for them, or ways in which works circulate in a public. So a lot of times I would make a work that was designed for a particular site, but then would immediately rip it out of its context and show it somewhere else, only retaining certain vestiges of the original site. So there was this dialectical play between something being in a site and then being displaced, and the deferments that are associated with that. So, for instance, Cole, you mentioned a film that I shot in 2008 at the Ford House in Aurora, Illinois, which was designed, I think, in 1949 and was finished somewhat after that. In 2002, I was in Chicago working on a collaborative project with an artist from Chicago named Galen Gerber, and we were installing a work at the Art Institute of Chicago. And we had the weekend off, and it was in the frigid month of January in Chicago, so snow everywhere, it was very cold. So we went out to see the Mies van der Rohe house in Plano, Illinois, and And then we had a little bit of time left over, and Galen turned to me and said, this Ford house by Bruce Goff is just about 45 minutes away. Would you like to see that? He knew that I had, I always describe myself as being a failed architect. So, I started my studies in architecture but didn't quite make it. So I just, the default was to become an artist and a musician. So I said, sure, I'd love to see this house. And so we drove to the Ford house, which is more or less a hemisphere, and a third of it is cut out and turned into glass curtain walls. So it's a very unusual circular designed house. And I knew about Bruce Goff's work and I respected his work, but in a colloquial way, I didn't think that his work was my cup of tea. But I walked into this building and immediately recognized it as being a serious and radical proposition about how one could live one's life in a different way. And also being the inveterate formalist that I am, I thought this house is dying to have a semicircular tracking shot in a film. So that is where my project started. So it really was based upon a misunderstanding and a misapprehension. And so in the 6 ensuing years, from the origin story to the completion of the film, I kept asking myself, how was it that I was so late to the party to appreciate Bruce Goff? And my alibi is that I think that so much of his work was photographed in color in the 1950s, when color reproduction in magazines was operating at a very kind of low technical level. And so it kind of exaggerated the garishness of his work. And so when I actually experienced it in its material state, it was an entirely different phenomenological effect that it had upon me, and a quite profound one. But that was my point of departure. I didn't know that he had identified as a painter. I didn't know that he had identified as a composer. He stopped composing when he turned 30 because he thought there were fewer great modern architects than modern composers, and maybe he would have a better shot at success. But his music was quite advanced, if one wants to use that kind of term, for the 1930s. And he would write for player piano as a way to use in a kind of industrial mediator, as a way to generate his music. And that was years before Colin Nancaro became known for composing primarily for the player piano. But maybe that's enough now. Maybe you can talk a little bit about sight.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to start, and perhaps speaks to the beginning of our collaboration with David. In the sense that I think for us as architects, I think a thing that connects David's practice with our work is a real strong interest in history. And for us, history, when we think about sites and we hear about contextualism and sort of site-specific responses in architecture, but I think for us it's, we always begin a project looking both historically at a place, at a kind of group of people, a sort of larger ecosystem around a place. And I think it's not about being historical necessarily, but really about understanding those deeper stories to envision the future. And sort of there's an openness that we try to achieve in our work that can both harness that sort of historical traces or layers of a place or an institution or a family as a way to kind of envision a future practice. And David and we had the chance to first start working together on a project at the MCA in Chicago. David was an artist trustee there. And part of, and for those of you guys that know that building, it's a Joseph Paul Kleihuis building. It's a very tough, kind of brutal, very gridded, serious building that is pretty oppressive. It's not very porous or generous to its surroundings. And we were thinking a lot about the legacy of museums in Chicago. The sort of museum in the park is really the great tradition, and we, got to know David quite early on in the process, and he, connected us as he was living there to the kind of great legacy of greenhouses that are part of the legacy of parks, conservatories in the city, and that became such an important touchstone for us to sort of open up a new conceptual framework to think about this very heavy, internally oriented building, and inspired many layers of both the initial renovation and the future plans that we have. And maybe just to touch on one other project quickly to talk about the question of site, which is the Drawing Institute, the project in Houston that we just finished. And that's a place that's very laden with history. The Manil family, came from Europe, and their whole tradition of thinking about not only kind of historical works of art and the kind of far-reaching nature of their collection, but also their cultivation of architects. And so, when we began that project, we were looking at the Philip Johnston House, which was the first project, or not the first, they first built the Rothko Chapel, then they built the house with Philip Johnston, of course, the Manil collection with Renzo. And I think our goal at the end, as we were designing that project, was to hope that when people came to visit the campus and see our building, that in a way it was hard to discern what period in history or what period of time it came from. And that it was sort of the reweaving together of the kind of legacy of the courtyard, the kind of the low-slung roof that was echoed in Renzo's building with the leaves, all of those layers, the bungalows, they're all sort of in there, yet they're woven together in a different way. And I think that's how we try to think about site, and I feel like that connects very much with both of you guys in this sort of multi-layered way that you're thinking about time and materiality as well as specifics of a place.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe on that note, it would be, David, I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more, too, about this idea of rewriting new narratives, into the space. You gestured towards that, and maybe specifically about how you did that here at Beth Sholom, what that process was like, and how you came to this constellation of materials and other situations.
Sure. Again, when presented with the opportunity of making a work on this site, perhaps the only apprehension that I had was the narrative of Wright, of Frank Lloyd Wright, and how overwhelming, very easily overwhelming that could have been. And also, I think, one that was being covered very adequately by the docent staff here. I think that they do an amazing job at explaining that story and explaining that history. And the other thing is that when you're in the presence of the building, it's impossible to escape that. So any work that I might have made here could have quickly disappeared in the shadow of that narrative. And so it was important to me not only to connect it to some of the ideas that activated my practice historically, but to also find perhaps new ways to occupy or understand the space that were rooted in the history of the space, but that perhaps weren't, I don't want to say that they were suppressed, but that they didn't have a kind of presence, and that they didn't have the capacity to announce themselves. And so, as I said, finding out a little bit about the history of the congregation specifically, which I think is really important, that, buildings in themselves are containers, and that we only understand them through a kind of cultural occupation, and that kind of context can change very easily. And knowing that the congregation, began down on Broad Street in the Logan neighborhood, and that through the process of suburbanization in the late 50s began, the march north into the Elkins Park neighborhood. That's an important part of the narrative, and that's an important part of understanding the genesis of the building. But also where they came from is equally important. And so, making a work that began to kind of address that passage, I saw as being rich in potential. And I also saw the former site as being rich in potential, and understanding that, the current tenants of the former synagogue on Broad Street is a Black evangelical church. It allowed for me to connect, I think, more deeply to this idea of the relationship between the people that inhabit the space and how we understand it, and how it can change and be gracious and generous. And again, just kind of stressing, like, our inhabitation today is a very different kind of inhabitation that happens, that happened yesterday, in the synagogue. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that kind of capacity to shift and change and to accommodate these different understandings. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe certainly. Please go ahead.
I think also, that was also something that really drew me to Stephen's piece. I had the privilege of showing a copy of the 35 millimeter film in my class maybe about 3 years ago. And what I was really drawn to was, again, it was a Goff building. It did have this kind of eccentric kind of history, a particular kind of exuberance. And I was really interested in the way that Stephen was able to untangle some of the latent narratives, but also to foreground ideas that were perhaps lost in a kind of formal appreciation of the space. And I think that that's something that artists and the capacity of art, can do in terms of recalibrating how a space expresses itself. Yeah.
I'm just beginning to process what you've done here. I've only visited the synagogue today, but one of the first elements that I take away from it is the constitution of your subjectivity, because I think that you're so pivotal in this. So this is not so much about unpacking the architecture of the synagogue per se, but unpacking your subjectivity as a spectator of your own work. And that seems to be the mechanism and the very subject matter at play here. So, for instance, that you find this composer, Gottschalk, and where there's a certain parallel with your history, but it's also a parallel with the way that you think the world. And so it doesn't surprise me that you would walk in here with your even a provisional understanding of the history of this space and the history of this particular congregation, that would be part of your the framing mechanism for making sense of this as a site. And it reminds me of the Belgian filmmaker Chantal Akerman, who came up at dinner the other night when we were discussing. But at one point she said, I try to make my work as particular as possible, as particular to my own subjectivity as possible, as a way for it to be relatable to the largest group of people. So, it's not the kind of conciliatory attitude that you try to figure out what your audience wants or needs or quote unquote can handle, that I think is condescending, but it's the way that you try to make your work as particular in relationship to your own subjectivity, so it's almost an alienating factor so that other people can reflect upon their own subjectivity in relationship to it. So I would have never brought in Gottschalk as the musical influence, but that is what you're calling upon me to account for in this. And I think it follows through with your videos downstairs, where it's as though it's an expanded idea of landscape, aka site, and you've just located it in Louisiana and Haiti, as opposed to perhaps what might immediately come to my mind. And so I think that you've really placed emphasis upon the very idea and mechanism of what it means to be a spectator. And it's as though this is almost like a journal of you walking into the synagogue for the first time and beginning to take notes. And then you want to share those with people.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that just quickly that as the architect in the room, I'm reading the architecture through Dave. Yeah, but I mean, I appreciate what you just said, Stephen, and I think what certainly this was perhaps in David's mind, but for me, especially for those of you that were here earlier and heard the music. Anyway, that can stay there. Heard the music, both the live music, but also, thank you so much, the music pieces that David had put together that included, even sounds of birds and other natural sounds that somehow, especially never having been here during a sort of spiritual meeting, that I start to read this space in a much more almost industrial way. I mean, the detailed selection of the sort of platforms that still have the writing on it from shipping to David's studio, and the kind of unadorned clear plastic pots of the orchids. It has I feel even, it's like sort of greenhouse or the tent. It sort of makes me reread the architecture in a very different way, and I'm sure that was somehow in your intention, but not primary. And so I love this idea you speak about, Stephen, of the sort of absolute subjectivity allows it to unleash even other intended maybe misreadings or not, but I think that's a really powerful quality of the work.
And then, just to reflect upon the introduction of the orchid, because I see certain arrangements of foliage here that are maybe appropriate and some that are inappropriate, and so you found a space for both. So you've removed the artificial plantings, and you've made a substitute of these tropical offerings, and with the all-important Spanish moss included into the arrangements, to again I read that as a marker of Louisiana, for instance. But then you have these platforms that were not designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I don't think that they were the idea of the congregation here. And so this is you cleaving a space for another kind of consideration about how plants live in this space, and the introduction of the of the orchid, and what is it? A non-parasitical plant. Mm-hmm. So here we get the play of the appropriate and the inappropriate. But then I see this kind of duality all the way through the show, and the way that you've set up the tapestries, and the way that you've set up the music, and the way that you've set up the videos. And so it never seems to fixate on one thing to become a reductive meaning, but it's always a mechanism of this and that, and what is the space that we traverse in going from this to that.
Thank you both. I actually, perhaps to kind of continue on that thread, I was thinking. I mean, Sharon, working with you on the project for Dropbox, I think that sometimes the commissioning agent in these cases has no idea the capacity of the space or how to think about the space. And it was so illuminating for me working on that project, because what you had done is you had foregrounded the idea of that corporate headquarters as a cultural space. And I think that the staff of Dropbox were focused on the function of work, and the way that you helped them see the potential of the space, and the potential to think beyond perhaps how they had been working before. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that process of guiding and informing and expanding through the process of working people's ideas of space, because I think that that's as much at play as with what I'm doing here in attempting to extend that understanding.
Yeah, so David and I had we were starting this kind of large project for our corporate headquarters for the tech company Dropbox, and what was interesting about it was that they were trying to re-envision work as a kind of creative enterprise, and so we felt like the way to really make that a meaningful discussion as a starting point was to put together a think tank of folks that were sort of outside of their culture, but so David was part of it. There was a curator, people involved in sort of cultural programming, and an industrial designer. And I think, perhaps what is interesting to speak about today relative to that is that we, through these different levels of expertise of the folks that were part of this conversation, we each one of us sort of recontextualized the problem of work and culture within a group of people in very different circumstances. And I think it really resonated. It sort of created new orbital structures for how we designed, how we engaged with our client. And I think that's often, especially as architects, where the sort of hegemony of building practice and zoning problems and all these sort of rules that are top down for us. I think collaborating with artists and David in particular has been a way to sort of shake that loose and create new kind of context to think about very kind of paradigmatic problems. And I think that resonated so much throughout the project. We developed a sort of report at the end of it, and so many meetings we kept going back to that and finding sort of redigging back into it. So I think it set a new precedent for how the company even wants to engage with their own internal discourse. So.
Stephen, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the kind of methodologies that you take up to approach the subjects that you described in the various projects, both at the Secession, and would be great to expand on that.
So a project that I made originally for the Secession in Vienna, its point of departure was much earlier in time. So it started with an anecdote. So the title of it is As He Remembered It. And in the mid-1980s, Christopher Williams and I already mentioned Chris, but Christopher Williams and I were on La Brea Avenue in Los Angeles at night. And from across the street, in a storefront window, we could see what appeared to be a piece of furniture that was pink, glowing in a spotlight. And we thought, what is this? And we couldn't identify it. And I don't even think that we were aware of a gallery being in that particular location. So I'm sure we jaywalked, which you're not supposed to do in Los Angeles. Anyway, but and when we got to the window, luckily there was a label identifying this piece of furniture as designed by R.M. Schindler, the Austrian modernist architect. But it was very, very clear that this is one of his pieces of furniture that was designed as a built-in piece of furniture in a building that he had designed. And it had been ripped out, it had been painted pink, and it was being offered for sale as an autonomous object. And both Chris and I were struck by this. We were horrified by it, and it appeared to be as though it were an amputated limb. And so this image stayed with me for years and years, and I couldn't get rid of it. I think I tried to get rid of it, and I couldn't get rid of it. And it kept returning, and I thought, well, I don't know what to do with this. If I'm going to make an artwork out of this, I don't really even know where to begin. And it wasn't until, 2010 or something, or 2009, that I received a formal invitation from the Secession in Vienna. And the Secession has a very long and honored history. It's considered the first white cube gallery in the modernist history. And for some reason, the meeting of this distant memory and the offer of a particular space allowed everything to fall into place. And within a few days, I had the basic structure of the entire work. But then the work had to begin. And so I did some research, and I knew that at the University of California in Santa Barbara, they have an extensive holding of architectural drawings, and I believe that they have most, if not all, of the Schindler drawings that are extant. And so I did some research about buildings by Schindler, and whose practice, primarily unfolded and matured in Los Angeles. But I located 2 different buildings that he had designed and that that had been built. And for the longest time, I thought, well, which one of these buildings will I focus upon for my project? And I kept going back and forth between the 2, because it was my intention to use the drawings to identify all of the built-in furniture designs, and then to manufacture them as autonomous elements, as though they had been ripped out of a building and function as amputated limbs. So it was kind of accelerating and exacerbating the horror of my original experience. But then there was one moment, and because I was really being vexed by this decision, and I realized, well, no, this is why I'm being vexed by this, because it's not about, it doesn't come down to making a decision of one building over the other. I had to decide to take both of them. So it had to be the 2, and the 2 would defy the pressure and the demand of the one. And so one house was very, very small. I think it's not even 600 square feet, and it had been designed for a couple, but then the husband died, so it turned out to be a house for a widow, Rose Harris, and that was designed in the early 1940s and built in Laurel Canyon. And then the other building was a residence/studio for an artist named Hilaire Heiler, and that was in what is West Hollywood. But what was important to me is that, yes, these had been designed by Schindler, built by Schindler, and then they were demolished. So they were no longer extant, and they only existed in memory or in the form of preparatory drawings. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Schindler's preparatory drawings, but they were very abbreviated, because a lot of times he functioned as his own contractor, and he would just, even freehand, just draw a few lines and make a couple of indications with the idea that we'll work that out on site. And so I worked with a couple of architects, and they helped me interpret the drawings and come up with a suite of 28 separate pieces of built-in furniture. But that was kind of an important moment for me, realizing, so for instance, I said that, once I got the invitation, the structure fell into place. But of course, that's when the work began. And that's when I had to try to be very self-critical about, well, am I just doing this the way I would ordinarily do anything? Or what are the questions that I need to ask myself to actually generate the work and make it the strongest version of the work that I could? And maybe just a note about the pink. I don't know how that object in the storefront on La Brea Avenue in the mid-'80s became pink, but there's the legendary story of the estranged wife of R.M. Schindler, and that when they went their separate ways, they still lived in the same home that had been built for 2 different families, but then she took one wing and he took the other, and they connected in the kitchen. And I guess there was such a high degree of animosity that they made sure that they weren't in the kitchen at the same time, and they would leave notes for each other. So she painted her wing of the house pink. And some people read that as feminist revenge. This is the way that she was going to enact a gesture against her patriarchal husband. But then some people read it as like, this is the Schindler house that's on Kings Road in Los Angeles. I think it was built in 1922. And I was talking to the director of the space, and who had been there for about, over 5 years. And she said, well, the insulation isn't very good. And sometimes when I have board, meetings here, we like hover around space heaters. And so her reading of it was, well, no, this wasn't a feminist act of revenge. It was just a way to cozy up the place a little bit. So, and I love the fact that there were these, it was practical and convivial. And so I love the fact that there were these two conflicting stories. Both seemed plausible and adequate, but incommensurable. And in discussing this with the director, I was having a very hard time of coming to terms with the pinkness of my memory. And I thought, well, am I just going to pick a pink that seems to match my memory, or am I going to, is it going to be generated some other way? And when I was told that when they did the renovation of the house, that they tried to get rid of all the pink, but they couldn't, and I could come over and inspect some in the little nooks and crannies, and that's when I thought, that's absolutely what I do not want to do. It's not kind of tracing the original pink. And so luckily in my tardiness in getting around to this project, the year that I realized the project, the Pantone color of the year was honeysuckle pink. So industrial, so the color industry solve the problem for me, and so I painted all of those, the 28 objects pink by hand in a gestural way. So they were kind of anti-industrial in that respect. But for that,
can I ask another question, David? Something that you just talked about a bit, Stephen and David. I see in your work is maybe links your practices, but the idea of kind of loss and memory, sort of. And I'm even thinking about sort of ruins and entropy. And David, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe related to this project or your work more generally.
That's great. And I also wanted a chance to also respond to a point that Stephen brought up, but I think initially, I think, it definitely, Sharon, you had mentioned the industrial quality of the space here, and the choice of materials in terms of the planters was definitely a response to what I saw as kind of an aesthetic that established a kind of American attitude, a kind of, using the products of industrialization as a way of distancing the architecture from this European heritage. So trying to channel that language, but also I think in some ways trying to reassert the functionality of the materials. I think that the decision to kind of create these planes was a way to kind of counter the actual geometry of the room, to also talk about it as a kind of interior landscape, which I think you had remarked on, Stephen. But also an image that really impressed me and that I was reminded of when I came into the site was an image by Hubert Robert, the French painter, who did a painting of the Louvre as a ruin, with the ceiling open and a garden growing inside. And in some ways I was thinking of that, how do I begin to actually create an experience that anticipates potentially that future state. So in some ways, this is a kind of response. And if we talk about, the idea of multiple communities being held together within the space, we also can talk about multiple temporalities occupying the space simultaneously, which I also find very exciting. So to anticipate the ruin is present. Going back to the points that you made about color, Stephen, and the kind of accuracy or its relationship to memory, I don't know if I would say cozying up, but there was definitely, the pink lights that are present in the lower spaces. I could have used, those are all grow lights, first of all. So because many of the planting beds are underground and not close to windows, the plants would have died in short order if we didn't actually give them light. But there are full spectrum LED lights that don't have to be pink that I could have used, but I thought it was important to kind of announce the kind of alien quality of those, and I love driving by in the evening and seeing the pink glow emanating from the windows. And I wonder, as you were telling us that story about seeing the shop window with Williams, whether or not the experience might be similar for somebody, Yeah. Exactly. But I'm also reminded of, I did a piece at the Graham Foundation a couple of years ago, and I spent some time up in the Moshe Safdie archive at McGill University looking at his drawings and models for Habitat Puerto Rico, which was begun, and they worked on it for about 5 years, and then the project was abandoned and reclaimed by the jungle. And poring over the drawings, and but also many of the finished choices. So I was actually looking at color charts that they were using for the cabinetry that had been selected for the habitat, prefab habitat units, and part of the exhibition involved these sculptural shells that were present within the exhibition, and I remember laying out all of the color choices based on the cabinetry, and that definitely informed my decision in terms of what color to apply to the aluminum shell. And I understand that tension because I was really kind of considering, how accurate do I want to be and how kind of expressive do I want to be. I erred on the side of accuracy, though. So it was as close as I could remember. Yeah.
Did you want to say that?
To make a follow-up comment about color, a lot of people read my project, as you remembered it with this pink furniture, as being an attempt to queer Schindler or to queer a leading modernist architect, and I must admit I didn't even think of that, but maybe I can't help myself. So because the term pinking is a term that is often used to talk about queering something, however that may be read, and so so perhaps that was inadvertent, or maybe it was just my unconscious being extremely loud at that point. I had something to say about me feeling like a meta subject in your work, because I made the comment that for me this seems to that you were the pivot in this, and drawing attention to your particular subjectivity and how you move through the world and how you think the world, and so it almost immediately made me start reflecting upon my experiences. And so you made me think of different kinds of artworks. Like there is an artwork by Deryka DeRoy that they made in 1998 called Of Three Men. And it's a 10-minute, 35-millimeter film that is always shown in installation, and the projection is enormous. So the projection is architectural in that respect. But it is of a dim interior of a church, of a neo-Gothic church. And then once your eyes adjust to the dimness, you realize that there are three men across the church, and they're praying. But they're not praying Christian hymns or prayers. This neo-Gothic church in Amsterdam has been converted to a mosque, and so they're Islamic. And so the idea that there's just this one long take where nothing is explained, but by the end of the 10 minutes, everything becomes abundantly clear about what you're watching. And it's about this displacement that I think in reading about your project in advance, I knew about the displacement from one neighborhood to another, and how one congregation takes over for another, and how that became so important to the very mechanism of your being. And so I think that that's what sparked I hadn't thought about this film in years. And then all of a sudden, this work and this kind of matrix of references that did not incorporate that is how it acted upon me and how I drew upon my own subjective experience.
One last question. Go for it. So before we open it up to the audience for questions, the one last question that I'd like to ask David's, in the course of making this project, we spoke so much about environments for viewing art, and certainly the experience of coming to a place like Beth Sholom to see work where you might not expect to find it. So certainly I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit about how you're thinking about the conditions for viewing work in the space, and certainly Stephen and especially Sharon talking about the design of these spaces for art, like how you think about that in your work.
Great. Yeah, I mean, this is a magnificent opportunity on so many levels. I think that in terms of my own practice, I had begun to recognize the limitations that I felt in terms of both exhibiting and looking at art in the context of a museum. One of the things that I had always felt as a kind of shortcoming was my relationship to the work based on ideas of time and a sense of comfort. And I don't just mean kind of like a nice chair to sit in, but a sense of the time that it takes to actually know a work. And so in some of my installations, I'd been creating seating elements and environments that allowed for, I think, a more kind of meditative or ambient kind of experience of the work. But to come into a space like this, a spiritual space, a space that had so many different modes of holding us and allowing for different kinds of spatial relationships, but also temporal relationships, I was really, really, really excited. This is a space of prayer. This is a space of exhibition. Right now it's a discursive space. And I love the ability to explore all of those potentials. I love the ability to sit with a work and spend time with it and not have its duration be determined by, a didactic that says it's 16 minutes long, or that there's somebody leaning over my shoulder waiting for their turn to look at the painting or sculpture or photograph. So really this has been, an incredible way of helping me work through what I might ask of myself in terms of creating experiences for art and creating opportunities for viewers to perhaps change their experience as well. Yeah.
I think maybe coming at that from the different perspective of a creative person making spaces for you guys. I think one of the things that's been really surprising to us would be that we would be sitting in these meetings with trustees and conservators and all the people that sort of deal with the operations of an institution that will be a host to your work. And that we were really surprised that artists were often not really, you were on the board of trustees at the MCA, but more often than not, artists weren't part of that conversation. And, we have made every effort in these projects, both for kind of museum and exhibition spaces. Also, we just finished an art school, and it was just imperative to us that artists were part of the conversation because artists were making a house for their work, and that we try to build a really diverse discourse around our work, and that if we weren't, if we think about the environment, the museum environment, as a kind of framework for artists to intervene and to transform, that I think that makes us think about the architecture, its degree of permanence, its degree of finish, its sort of ephemerality in a really different way, and I think that's something that we really strive for. I see Harry's here, and Harry Philbrook, who's leading us in the Philadelphia Contemporary Project, and he's just created such an incredible group of folks that are both, creative people, but also people that are part of the neighborhood, people that will use the building in a very sort of everyday way, and it just I think it opens up a whole nother understanding of time and just of the museum as a frame. It's continuous with the city and not a temple that's separate from it. I think that's maybe a really important takeaway in terms of where we are in our own practice with respect to cultural buildings.
And it's clear that, David, you will only exhibit your work in a white cube space, right? So, obviously not. And I think that that's one of the myths that I thought you were going somewhere else with I thought you were going to say that all the Board of Trustee members and the conservators and the institutional people were saying, oh, no, we have to have neutral spaces for the artists. And I know that some artists demand neutral spaces, whatever that is. I've never seen a neutral space, by the way. But it seems as though some people have come up with very strict definitions of what those are. But most of the artists that I know want to work in an architecturally engaging space. And people such as Danielle Buren and Michael Asher always said that, no, we don't want neutral environments. We want strong architecture where our work can respond to that. And so I'm always looking for a situation where I can respond to the architecture or get a cue from that. And I have so many stories about this where, showing a work at the Carnegie in Pittsburgh, and the curators just took it for granted that they had to build a very expensive, almost 2-story wall so as to cover over a window that was looking outside. And I said, and why are you designing this and building this? And they said, well, you couldn't want a window in your space. And the back wall is 120 degrees, not 90 degrees. I said, but if you cover up the window, the people looking at my work won't be able to glimpse at the Richard Serra that's outside. And my work is in conversation with both the outdoors and the Richard Serra. And so even the idea of a window in a gallery is very important to me, because I don't make my work to stand apart from the world. I make my work to be part of the world and to be conversant with it.
I think the point you made earlier, Stephen, about specificity in David's work, I think that's what a lot of artists have brought to our work. So it's not that things are just there's perhaps a dialogue or a kind of tension between degrees of specificity and degrees of openness, and I think that's really important. So it isn't just about light levels and, sort of all the museum practices that are so controlling. I think the artists have brought an openness or a sort of tension to the development.
Speaking of specificity, to speak about, for instance, the tapestry downstairs of the orchid. And so the orchid is presented sideways. It's presented on a monumental scale. It isn't in any space. There are no shadows. It floats. What's up with that?
I feel like I'm put on the spot, but that's literally what I am, right? So I was looking at paintings by Martin Johnson Heade, who was a landscape painter, loosely associated with the Hudson River School, as well as loosely associated with the abolitionist movement. He was a contemporary of Gottschalk, which I thought was important. Heade was making these fantastic paintings of orchids and of hummingbirds, and I was interested in the kind of nascent symbolism that he was trying to explore with those motifs. And there was something uncanny in the paintings. But I never want my work to be anachronistic. I want it to be of the present. I want to make the work today with an acknowledgement of the conditions of today, with cues that point back at these different histories. So how do I receive orchids? Finding them in grocery stores, as a kind of industrial product. So photographing them as found was something that was very important to me. But when I photographed it, I realized that that they had been entirely tamed, that it had lost its uncanny quality. And I was trying to find a way that I could reestablish that aspect of understanding and seeing the work. And just by simply turning it on its side, where it began to defy gravity, it reinfused it with an uncanny aspect. The scale and materiality are in response to perhaps Wright's concept of total design, a kind of immersion where the architecture stops and the design or the interior aspects start. I wanted to erase that, but I didn't want to do it in a way where they became decorative elements. So by actually countering the geometry of the room, the work kind of hovers back and forth between being an intervention and being of the space simultaneously. Yeah.
I think that might be a good place to bring you all in. If there are any questions from the audience, you're welcome to shout it from your seat. I can repeat it for the benefit of everyone else. Or you can come up and use the microphone as well, Stephen suggests.
Don't be shy. That's a great question. I think a lot of people have actually seen the flowers as proxies, which I kind of love. Even though they were chosen, I see them as diasporic plants. So I definitely did see them as beings that kind of moved through the world. I was also thinking the title of the work, the Histories, Le Mancenillier. Le Mancenillier is both the title of a piece of music by Gottschalk, but it's also a plant, and one of the most toxic plants in the world. The apple of the Le Mancenillier will kill you if you eat it. If you stand under, it's Mancenillier in English. If you stand under the Mancenillier, while it's raining, the runoff will actually cause your skin to blister off because the sap is that toxic. And for me, I was actually thinking of, there is an environmental kind of aspect to this work, a post-human aspect to this work. This idea that there's a kind of antagonistic relationship between what we consider the natural world and our own kind of cultural environment, our built environment. And so in some ways, again, going back to this idea of the Hubert Robert painting of the Louvre as a ruin, I do think of these spaces as post-human as well, as that exist beyond, our time here. And I think that's a subtle but important aspect to, I think, my consideration of space. Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you, Sharon. I think it goes back to my conception of the space as a landscape. And I mean, it's great. There were people sitting on the other side of the plant there, which I loved. I can't see them. And that I'm forced to kind of negotiate the space. That was a really important idea. It wasn't simply the conditions as designed and defined by the seating, but to insert other elements that were dynamic, that forced the viewer to renegotiate the space. Yeah.
I thought that was really a nice interpretation and a great question. And one of the things that struck me about the chairs and the sort of ground, I mean, this place feels very grounded to me, I think, through the sort of subtlety of the ramping, and it's sort of a bit non-hierarchical and maybe relationship to many other places of worship where the sort of axes and things like that. And I was particularly interested in the sort of multi-orientation of the chairs, that you feel very connected, but everyone's sort of looking at a slightly different axis. And that also sort of decenters the space as well. So, and then finally, I think I really see the industrial quality of this building in the chairs themselves. They're not, I mean, they're comfortable, but there's a lot of steel in the chair, which is also sort of surprising. The sort of, beam-like armature underneath it, and it makes me then look at the roof in a really different way. So I feel like there's a lot happening in the chair that's kind of puts the building into a different, kind of a different orbit.
And it seems to represent congregation itself, in in the way that a chair always suggests the person who might sit there. And so even if a chair is unoccupied, it suggests an occupancy in the future. And then I see your platforms and how they're taking some of the chairs out of commission, but maybe you're providing a foil for some people who would like to sit behind one and be, partially blocked, but their sight lines are still, not entirely impeded. And so this space that was trying to provide an equivalent sight line for all, you've messed with that a little bit. It's like, well, there are places where, I could imagine children loving to be under that one platform as though it were a fort or something. And we're not supposed to have bad thoughts at synagogue, but if they're providing me with the fort, I can go there and have a different kind of sequestered private experience. And so, is there room for a private experience within a public congregational setting? That is one of the things that one can take away from this intervention, I think.
Another thing, and one of the dimensions that we're missing right now in our experience of the installation is the music. And for me, it was really gratifying to see the performance earlier this afternoon. And I think right now our relationships are fixed, right? And there's a kind of spectator relationship. And what I loved about the performance was that that was never fixed, it was never established, that I loved walking in and seeing people constantly reorienting themselves in relationship to the sound. So they would sit over here and have one experience of it, and then they would move up to the top, be closer to a different speaker and have a very different experience of it. So they were reorienting themselves based on the spatialization of the sound as well as the landscape that was present. And seeing this as a dynamic space is really important to me.
Yes, please go ahead.
It's interesting. The way I see the image downstairs is about as close as I can get to a kind of awe. I mean, that for me is a spiritual moment. This kind of, it's very simple. What I was doing with a filter on the camera that created a kind of prismatic effect with light. But I mean, it was careful looking. It was also recognizing that despite the fact that we understand how these things are made, they still have the capacity to awe us. So that was something, that, all right, I'm given this opportunity to do something in a synagogue, and perhaps that's the closest moment that I come to in terms of recognizing the spiritual aspects of this exhibition. In terms of the relationship between recorded and performed music, one of the things that I was very conscious of was trying not to change the dynamics of experiencing the exhibition. And Cole and I went back and forth quite a bit. And, how do we expand on the program, introduce other voices, but without necessarily changing the dynamics so that it becomes one of spectacle. Even if it's a spectacle at a lower register, the idea of gathering around a performer and watching them perform the music, it thrusts the rest of the work into the background. And I wanted to keep those relationships more or less stable while still expanding the scope of voices and histories that participated. So, we can hear the piano as we walk in. We know there's a performer there because we might stick our head in, but there is something that's blocking us from actually performing the role of spectator. And instead, we then go back to that more ambient experience of the space that I had talked about earlier. It was important to keep that quality present regardless of whether or not it was live or Memorex. Yeah.
I just want to say something. Oh, sorry. I just want to say something in relationship to the awe response, because I was downstairs watching a video, and it seemed to be very much in the register of the post-human that you were talking about, because it was very clear that a lot of that was shot with a drone. So there's no one behind the camera, so to speak. I mean, someone put the drone and the camera into motion, but wasn't behind it per se. But then there was a moment when the flare happened in the video, and I wasn't prepared for that, but it didn't necessarily surprise me, because that was, again, I know how a star filter works, and it was this level of mediation between the landscape and me, even in a post-human condition. But then when I saw the tapestry, and you're freezing the moment of the flare, and you're freezing the moment that you describe as awe, at the moment that you freeze it, it becomes drained of awe, doesn't it? Because awe is that moment that, I mean, it's fleeting, it's ephemeral, it's something that we only catch almost peripherally, and then it's gone. But, the attempt to fix it seemed to drain it of all experience of awe at the same time. So it kind of instantiates it and denies it simultaneously. That was my experience of it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, building on that one thing that struck me, because I had that same experience, is that I all of a sudden started thinking about kind of icons and things that were happening up here because of that fixity and that sort of, that moment where it was no longer ephemeral and bursting. But
yeah, I mean, I totally agree.
It became symbol, and I recognized that. Yeah.
There's a question from Liz.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's great. And Sure. Liz was remarking on the kind of continuous experience that she felt moving from room to room, and how perhaps her experience felt grounded as those conditions changed. And I think that, you know, that's an aspect of the architecture, and it's an aspect of me, you know, going back to this notion of site specificity, listening to and recognizing. I mean, Wright is so specific in the way that he orchestrates an experience of space. So regardless of whether or not you come in through the entrance that most of you entered, through the President's Lounge, or you're coming in through the front door over here, you know, there's that kind of compression, right, that you're put into a shallow, low-ceiling space, and that you come out into this, you know, glorious kind of spanning space. That's something that Wright is, you know, it's a device that he uses again and again in so many of his buildings, and I know that. You know, I can't change those conditions, so I might as well try and see how I can, you know, use them effectively. But also, it's equally, I can't take credit for his genius in that way. Yeah. Did you guys want to? Okay.
But you should take credit for strategically using so many different spaces in the building, because you know, I think that a lot of people would think of the gentleman's lounge or the ladies' lounge as being, you know, auxiliary, and you have made them primary in a different way. You put them on this on another plane where they interact in an equivalent way with other spaces. So I think that those spaces are as important as this space, and I don't think I would have that kind of reading of it if it were not embellished by you at this moment. So
there's a really beautiful moment in my mind where the boundary conditions of the exhibition are set, and it's actually downstairs in that kind of central landing. The lower chapel, the Sisterhood, directly below us, the actual fake plants are still present. And so on one side of the glass are the fake plants, and then on the other side of the glass, lit by the grow lights, there's the real plants. And for me, it was really important. We went back and forth, like, do we want to just replace everything? And I said, no, I think it's actually important to contrast, to actually demonstrate the boundaries of the work. Yeah.
We can do, yep. Is there any lingering questions? I think with that, we'll turn the music. Oh yeah, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you.